Start recording. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you can, please turn your cameras on. And I just wanted to say I'm Miriam Green, Director of Marketing and Alumni Affairs. And again, thank you for joining us today for our Alumni Association's Torch Talks event. It's wonderful to have so many people with us today. And there are many ways that you can get involved with us, from participating in future events, whether digital or in person, sharing your alumni story and photos, letting us know about job openings to put on our alumni job board, organizing a reunion, and giving to the Alumni Annual Fund, which supports scholarships for HU students. Or you can give to our Igniting Impact Initiative, which supports 3 social impact projects at HU. They are, hold on one moment, the Ethiopian Farmers Outreach Project. This initiative creates an avenue for Israeli and international students to farm alongside Ethiopian community elders to exchange ideas and share experiences through weekly workshops, helping to transfer knowledge between cultures and generations. The Legal Clinic for Representation of Marginalized Communities. This program helps vulnerable individuals to negotiate the policies and practices that may hinder the exercise of their rights and impinge upon their dignity. In addition to providing legal services, the clinic integrates academics with practical work for law students. And Global, a master's degree in community development, where we're supporting internships and seed funding for alumni projects. Global trains young professionals as community development workers. An integral part of the program is the internship, where students gain the skills, knowledge, and experience needed to help improve the lives of people in disadvantaged communities around the world. To learn more, please email alumni@afhu.org. Today, as you may have noticed, everyone will be on mute, but we will be taking questions at the end. To submit a question, please type it in the chat box and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. I'm now pleased to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Asaf Lubin is an associate professor of law at Indiana University Maurer School of Law and a fellow at IU's Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research. He is additionally an affiliated fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project, a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and a visiting scholar at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem Fetterman Cybersecurity Research Center. His research centers around the intersection of law and technology, particularly as it relates to the regulation of cybersecurity, harms, liabilities, and insurance, as well as policy design around governmental and corporate surveillance, data protection, and internet governance. His work draws on his experiences as a former intelligence analyst, sergeant major with the IDF intelligence branch, as well as his vast practical training and expertise in national security law and foreign policy. Dr. Lubin's work additionally reflects his time spent serving as a Robert L. Bernstein International Human Rights Fellow with Privacy International, a London-based not-for-profit devoted to advancing the right to privacy in the digital age and curtailing unfettered forms of governmental and corporate surveillance. Asaf, it's a shame you're not more accomplished. All right, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm particularly delighted to be at an event organized by Hebrew University and Hebrew University's Alumni Network. I am myself an alum of Hebrew University's law faculty and attribute so much of what I've done in my career to my first interaction with the law through the Faculty of Law at Hebrew University. So it's a real particular kind of closure moment for me, and I'm slightly getting emotional just thinking about it. So I'm here to discuss a sexy topic, espionage and how to regulate it. And it's based on research that I conducted for the past 10 years, which will be coming out as a book next year with Oxford University Press. So already the daunting challenge is to take something that I've devoted so much of my career to and try to summarize it into a 30-minute presentation. That's never easy, and I'm going to do my best to also be as animated as I can throughout it. So that's my goal today. But at the outset, let me explain to you what I mean when I say the word espionage, because that word doesn't have a universal, well-recognized definition as a matter of international law. So I provide you a definition, by no means the controlling one, just a working definition that we will use for today's presentation. So when I say espionage or any other kind of interchangeable word like surveillance or intelligence gathering. What I mean is an operation that occurs in peacetime. And that is not to say that there's no wartime intelligence gathering. There's a lot of it happening. But the wartime intelligence gathering is less interesting from a legal perspective because there's a lot of rules that control how intelligence is to be gathered in wartime under the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, and I'd be more than happy to discuss that in the Q&A. But we're focusing today only on peacetime intelligence collection. We'll also focus on interstate operation. That is to say, operations that are launched by agents of one state or those with a sufficient nexus to the state against targets at a foreign state, their subjects, associations, corporations, or agents, without the knowledge or consent of that state. That is not to say that there's no intelligence gathering done by non-state actors. There's plenty of that, from Hamas on the one hand, a paramilitary group, to business intelligence collection done by corporations. But we need to start somewhere, so let's start with the big chunk of it, interstate surveillance as a first kind of entryway into this space. Next, the operation involves the passive gathering, analysis, verification, and dissemination of information. I stress that word passive and not other forms of active wet work. When I say espionage, and in fact, the invitation for today's event kind of alluded to all kinds of James Bondy things. Now, there's a lot of James Bond in this space. I'm trying to limit our discussion to one aspect of the operations, those passive information gathering. Other things, commonly known as covert action, will be outside the scope of this presentation. So I'm happy to discuss, if you want in the Q&A, anything from election interference, propaganda, regime changes by the CIA in Latin America, you name it, the assassinations of people. But let's leave all of that outside and focus first on what is more mundane and common practice, information gathering, the passive aspect of these operations. And finally, the operations involve some degree of secrecy, both as to the choice of means and targets relating to the operation. And the reason why we need that caveat in there is because otherwise a diplomat sitting in their embassy in Berlin reading a newspaper would be an act of espionage, because otherwise it meets all other elements of this definition. We need to set those types of mundane information gathering by states from those intelligence gathering activities, and secrecy is possibly the most relevant factor to consider. So this is my definition. In the Q&A, please feel free to push back, offer an alternative definition. Let's test out some of those theories, but let's work with this definition. So let me now tell you a little bit about the context by which I got to doing this research. So as was mentioned, I was an intelligence analyst for the Israeli intelligence within the IDF. And this picture was taken when I was 18, far younger, sitting right there on the bottom left with my leg kind of stretched over. This is in the background is Syria. So this is one of Israel's intelligence posts overlooking Syria and the Golan Heights. And this was part of an intelligence training course that I participated in. And in fact, when I took my position, I had to go through a 6-month training course about how intelligence is to be collected. And on the top right is my commander at the time, Jonathan, who were training us on some of the issues that we were discussing. At no moment during our training did we engage in the complex question of the ethics of intelligence collection. In fact, in all my 5 years of service, I don't recall a single conversation about the word privacy, about the law or the morality associated with covert information gathering. And in fact, I believe that if I asked any one of my commanders these questions, they would probably scoff, saying to me, "You're kidding, right? Espionage is about lying and cheating and deceiving. There's nothing ethical about espionage. In fact, espionage is antithetical to ethics." Moving on, I went to Hebrew University of Jerusalem, did my first degree there. I took Moshe Hirsch, who's still there, vibrant as ever, took his course in international law. And I don't know if you've ever taken international law as a course, but if you did, you'd know that in the syllabus, the way the course is broken down is we look at various areas of state practice, from the law of the sea to the law of outer space. And in all areas, we discuss what regulations apply on the international level between states in this context. So you wouldn't be surprised that I expected to find between the week that talked about the laws of war and a week that talked about human rights law, a week devoted to the second oldest profession, which is espionage. Lo and behold, there was no week devoted to espionage in international law. And in fact, it's not unique. I don't blame Moshe Hirsch by no stretch. No one who teaches international law, if you open traditional syllabi, no one teaches espionage, despite it being a prevalent area of state practice, and in my opinion, one that is subject to certain kinds of regulations. And the reason for that could be that for many, international law and espionage start from very different premises. Espionage is about lying and cheating and deceiving, whereas international law is about the pursuit of justice where justice was once trampled. If so, the two, again, are antithetical to each other, and there's no point in engaging in the analysis. You can understand how this trajectory has naturally led me to write my application to Yale Law School for my master's degree, in which I wrote, I want to write the forgotten, missing textbook on the grand bookshelf of international law that addresses the international law of espionage. You can also understand that I used very bombastic language when I applied, and for whatever reason, they nonetheless led me into their program. And I spent the next 5 years researching the intersectionality of espionage and international law. And so what I will talk to you today is what I have found in my research and what ultimately ended up in my book. And what I realized is that it was wrong of me to assume that there is a missing textbook. In fact, there's been a lot that has been said over the generations about espionage as a matter of international regulation. Instead, what my book ended up saying is that everything that has been said has been lackluster, has been not particularly persuasive. So what I want to do in the next 25 minutes is 3 things. First, I'll tell you what everyone has said about espionage thus far. Then I'll try to argue to you why what they've said is not persuasive at all. And finally, I'll try to propose to you what I think about the regulation of espionage, applying it to particular kinds of case studies, including in the context of covert operations in foreign territory, as well as cyber espionage. Okay, so it's a quite a daunting challenge I've taken upon myself. I'll try to meet the time. So starting with the first, what have people said about espionage as a matter of international law? We can break that literature into 2 camps, an old school approach and a contemporary or new school approach. The old school approach was black and white. It was absolutist in nature. And it really draws on the 2 primary thinkers in international relations of the time, Hobbes and Kant. Kant took the prohibitionist camp. For Kant, the goal to be achieved by international relations is a perpetual peace. And what is more at odds with a perpetual peace than and I quote Kant here, are the diabolical acts, the intrinsically despicable acts of intelligence gatherers and saboteurs. For Kant, espionage destroys trust, and trust is a prerequisite for a lasting peace. And therefore, it is intrinsically bad. And therefore, spying, no matter for what cause or in what way, is inherently illegal and should be so as a matter of international law. If that is Kant's position, you wouldn't be surprised that Hobbes stands on the other side. Hobbes believed that he once said that intelligence officers are, quote, like rays of light into the human soul. He compared the state into a spider who is building up its spider webs. And on the webs are those intelligence officers who are feeding the spider information. In fact, for Hobbes, the idea is that if a leader decides not to spy, it is almost like a dereliction of duty. They have a responsibility to protect the polity at all costs, and that includes by the continuous gathering of information. Hobbes wasn't alone. Sun Tzu long ago said that the state should engage in spying for every kind of business. Sun Tzu is quoted as saying, spy, spy, and spy again. And indeed, a conceptualization of the prince as one whose job it is to protect the polity against imminent threats and dangers is one that assumes that the state will continuously spy. So no matter what is the cause or what is the manner by which the intelligence is gathered, for Hobbes, it would seem that spying is always legal. This is the permissivist camp for espionage. The third and final absolutist camp is the extra-legalist camp. And I would argue to you that this is still the camp that controls huge swaths of our international legal community. That camp can best be described by Professor Afshin John Radson from Mitchell Hamline School of Law, former Assistant General Counsel to the CAA, who in 2007 was invited by the Michigan Journal of International Law to present his positions on espionage and international law in a special symposium issue that they've organized. And in it, he wrote the following: mortals should not attempt to perform miracles. We cannot convert water into wine at weddings, turn lead into gold in a chemistry lab, or form a human being from a lump of clay. To accept reality is to abide by the laws of physics. And what are those laws of physics? Well, that espionage and international law are not workable as two systems. The two are intrinsically at odds, operating from two different points of view. In fact, he ends that article by saying that those who wish to engage in research and scholarship on espionage and international law, and I would have nay, those who want to write a doctoral dissertation on the topic, and then dare teach it in an undergraduate students to a Yale College, which I did for 2 years, or for that matter, in a presentation before Hebrew University alumni, do yourself a favor, he says in his article, move to other projects with grace. So my book begins by gracefully declining Radson's invitation. I don't believe that it is right to adopt an extra legalist viewpoint, one that says that espionage is simply outside the bounds of law, neither legal nor illegal. And for what it's worth, we have seen a gradual shift towards new school approaches that are very much pushing against this absolutist theory and have instead adopted a relativist theory of international law and espionage, one that starts from the premise that spying may sometimes be legal and sometimes be illegal. And so the only thing we debate in that new camp is what are the lines to be drawn for legality and illegality for certain kinds of espionage operations. Now, there's a pragmatist camp. A good representative of that is Ashley Deeks, who now works for the Biden administration. If you want to talk about that, I'll be happy to do it in the Q&A. But for the limited time that we have, I'll just focus on my theories and the people I represent versus the more common theory currently in the literature, which I call the piecemeal approach. So to understand what the piecemeal approach says, we might begin with the Tallinn Manual, which was an initiative set out by Michael Schmidt as the executive editor of this book, who brought together a group of international experts to try and address how international law applies in cyberspace. And one of the aspects of international law's applicability in cyberspace that they looked at had to do with cyber espionage operations. And what they conclude in that book is that international law does not per se regulate espionage, but that instead particular means of intelligence gathering could violate particular rules of international law. In other words, it's a piecemeal approach because we search for pieces of regulation within the grand archipelago of international law. And whenever we identify an island of regulation of general application, it might have something specific to say in this contextual application of it to intelligence gathering. So for example, if you're spying within the territory of the state, you might be violating that state's sovereignty, given that the prohibition on the protection of sovereign equality is a core tenet of international law. So sending human spies into the territory of another state without that state's consent is a violation of international law because it violates sovereignty. In fact, one colonel from the French Navy, Fabien Laforce, wrote a really famous article book in 2012 on espionage and international law, one of the biggest and most significant bodies of work on this topic. And in it, he draw this graph, which I translated to English for you. In this graph, he merely discusses spying vector and a territorial vector. On the spying vector, you have your spy ship, your spy aircraft, and your spy satellite. And on your territorial vector, you have various kinds of territorial zones, the territorial sea and land, and above them, the national airspace, all of which are spaces under national sovereignty, compared to your exclusive economic zone, high seas, outer space, international airspace, all subject to international spaces not controlled by any one state. And he argues that we can draw a black line right here. Every operation that will be conducted in this space under the piecemeal approach would be necessarily legal, because there's no piece of legislation we can turn to, namely sovereignty, sovereign equality, to argue that it has been violated in the context of these operations. Whereas every operation within this scope is illegal de facto and de jure, because it violates sovereignty, a core tenet of international law, and in fact could trigger international responsibility for the spying state. I'll just mention one other example of a rule that piecemeal scholars often cite to: diplomatic protections. So if you're spying from an embassy or spying on an embassy, you're violating the particular provisions of the Vienna Conventions of Diplomatic Relations, which say that an embassy cannot spy against the national security of the host state, and that the host state cannot spy on the embassy against its diplomatic inviolability of its premises and diplomatic bag. So in other words, we have another set of rules that we can try and build a case on to make certain kinds of espionage operations illegal. Everything I just said to you, I think, is wrong. And what I've done over the last multiple years is attend so many panels with so many of my colleagues who I appreciate dearly, just vehemently disagree with on everything they've said. So what I'll try to do in the next couple of minutes is prove to you why I think this is wrong. And I'll start with the first thing. This is wrong because it creates a chasm. This theory is wrong because it creates a chasm between what Michael Reisman from Yale Law School calls the myth system and the operational code, between the law in the books and the law in practice. Because it's nice to cite all these mythical texts like the UN Charter's prohibition on interfering in sovereignty or the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, but the reality in practice is that every state on this planet is spying in the territory of another state. To argue otherwise would be to completely cover your eyes with a blanket from what is the devastating blows of sun rays. The reality is that states spy and use this tool continuously. And so what you're creating by stating that the law exists as it is described in the books is a chasm with reality. And as Kelsen has taught us, the validity of the law presupposes a minimum efficacy of the law. If we continuously push for a version of the law that is completely detached from reality, we will lose a basic validity of the law. People will stop trusting international law as a legal system because they will look at the rules and they look at reality and will see this massive gap between the two. A second reason why we should discredit this approach has to do with something known as TWAIL. TWAIL stands for Third World Approaches to International Law. It's a critique by the global South against the global North, which says the rules set out by the global North only aim at entrenching the power imbalance between the North and the South, between the developed and the developing. Let me show you how their version, the piecemeal approach version of espionage regulation, is hurting the global South twice over. The first way it's hurting the global South is by saying that the most primitive ways of spying have just been deemed illegal. You cannot send your human spies into foreign territory, probably the cheapest way of spying, because that would be a violation of sovereignty. That would be illegal under the piecemeal approach. What you can do is send a satellite to outer space. That's legal because that's done from outer space outside of territorial control. So we've now made the more expensive forms of spying legal, thereby supporting those rich and powerful with the capacity to engage in them. More so, we're inviting a market space for espionage, what has been called surveillance capitalism. Because to the extent that the spying entities are not states, but rather third-party corporate entities, Facebook, Amazon, Google, where they're collecting the intelligence and we, the country, only compel them to release the data back to us, that's completely lawful as a matter of the piecemeal approach because it doesn't violate sovereignty. It's done through the consent of users who are using these applications. But who can compel Google and Facebook and Amazon to release data? It's not going to be countries in the global south. It's only going to be the countries with the biggest business capacity who can then compel these companies to release the data, or they won't do business in their country anymore, hitting their bottom line. So again, we're creating a marketplace whereby surveillance through intermediaries is favored and legalized, and thereby supporting those countries with the means to do so. The third and final reason I'll state now for why I think the piecemeal approach is wrong has to do with what one scholar called a cyber headache. So I'll skip a couple of slides, I'm trying to get ahead. Let's think about this scenario, okay? In this scenario, we have hackers operating from one country, spoofing their way through the internet dark webs, all the way to a victim. This time it's an embassy of the United States in Jordan, and through it hopping into the State Department's databases in DC. Look at all these countries whose servers and networks have been spoofed along the way. Under the piecemeal approach, can we or can we not say that the sovereignty of all these countries been violated? In other words, going back to Fabienne Lafosse's beautiful graph, the assumption when drawing this black line here is that this line is clear, that it has no degradations of gray. But the reality is that line is far from clear. In the cyber context, it's not always obvious what constitutes a breach of sovereignty in the sending of zeros and ones across borders. But it's not only in the cyber context that the line becomes gray. Here's another context. Think about high altitude drones operating right at the cusp between national airspace and international outer space. In that sense, at what point can we say that they've crossed into the territorial and thereby created the violation of sovereignty on which they hold all the sense of legality that they are basing their arguments on? As we advance more technologies that engage in various forms of remote or operating at the edges of doctrine, we complicate the ability to rely on territorial rules to address very unterritorial environments, new environments, cyberspace being chief amongst them. So for these reasons, I would argue to you that the piecemeal approach, what is the most common approach within the new school now, is not satisfying to me. And instead, I want to propose to you a theory that has been pushed by a group of intelligence ethicists, but has not yet been translated into the language of the law. It's been pushed predominantly by moral philosophers. And it's built on a moral philosophy doctrine that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, just war theory. So the people who build their theories on intelligence on just war theory say that there is a lot to make a comparison to between just war theory and intelligence work. And in fact, that the same model we use for thinking about the regulation of war can be also used for thinking about the regulation of intelligence. In other words, that intelligence can be regulated at three distinct temporal stages: before, during, and after. So if you look at this slide, this is how international law operates for the use of force. We talk about human rights law, or the law of peacetime. We talk about the use ad bellum, the law justifying launching wars. We talk about the use in bello, the law during war. And we talk about the use post bellum, the law after war. And we have bodies of work and literature and research going on through the ages that have mapped out what rules apply in each of these temporal stages. So intelligence moral philosophers say, why not copy paste this in thinking about intelligence? In other words, the use ad intelligentsia, the law for launching an intelligence operation, the use in intelligentiam, the law while the intelligence operation is conducted, and the use post intelligentsia, the law after the operation has ceased, namely dealing with accountability and responsibility. So that's the model that I have built my book around, and I would try to argue to you that it has grounding within existing international law. So within the limits of my presentation, I can't possibly cover all of this, but I'll try to give you one first example of it. And I will try to argue to you that the state currently possesses, as a matter of customary international law, the right to spy under certain circumstances. And I will use one of my favorite stories of all times, Bibi Netanyahu going in 2012 to the UN General Assembly with a drawing of a coyote-like bomb, which has been put to laughter by so many late night talk show hosts that I cannot do justice for. But I'll try to explain to you what was Benjamin Netanyahu's thinking in doing that act. So Benjamin Netanyahu, 2012, this is before the Iran deal, before the Obama administration signs that deal. At that time, everyone's talking about, is Israel going to attack Iran to impact their development of their nuclear program? And Benjamin Netanyahu goes to the UN General Assembly with a bomb and takes a red Sharpie and he draws a line at 90% enrichment to indicate to the world that for the Israeli polity, when the Iranians reach 90% enrichment, that would be our red line. At that moment, we are entitled to act in anticipatory self-defense against this imminent threat, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. Now, I was working for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the time, and I can tell you that there were various kinds of legal interpretations on what should be that red line. Should it be 90% enrichment, or should it be something else? For example, the Americans were telling us, your red line should be a nuclear warhead. When you have definitive proof that the Iranians have developed a nuclear warhead, that is the capacity to take their nuclear material, put it on a missile, a Shihab 3 missile, and shoot it at you, that's when we will say that the threat is imminent, overwhelming, leaving no choice of me, no moment for deliberation. The Europeans were telling us, no, don't listen to the Americans. They got Iraq all wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. You want to know what an imminent threat is? An imminent threat is a Shihab 3 missile with fire coming out of its bum. At that moment in time, and only in that moment, the threat is imminent, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means. And if you talk to the Chinese or the Brazilians at the time, they would have adopted a textualist approach to the UN Charter, which says, you want to know when you can use force? You need to have the Shihab 3 missile actually fall on Tel Aviv. That is to say, first suffer an armed attack, then take reciprocal action. And or go to the UN Security Council, as is provided under Article 51 of the UN Charter, and seek a Chapter 7 resolution for enforcement action from the international community. But without either of those things, without an armed attack already suffered, or a UN Security Council authorization, you cannot use force in an anticipatory fashion. Now, here's the big aha moment of this entire presentation. It doesn't matter which of these legal interpretations of the rules of the use of force you adopt. All of them assume that in peacetime, Israel will be intimately collecting espionage about Iran. For how else will Israel know that the Iranians have reached 90% enrichment? For how else will Israel know that the Iranians have acquired a nuclear warhead? For how else will Israel know that there's a Shihab 3 missile with fire coming out of its bomb? For how else will Israel be able to produce the evidence necessary to persuade the UN Security Council to authorize a Chapter 7 resolution under the Chinese approach that would allow us to use force in retaliation against Iran? In all of these theories, there's a prerequisite presumption that Israel engages in intelligence collection. And in fact, if we look across all fields of international law, there is all kinds of evidence to support the fact that states need to collect intelligence constantly and intimately in order to make our international legal order function. I wrote an article for the Harvard International Law Journal in 2020 called The Liberty to Spy. I get into the weeds of more examples like this there. But to prove to you that I'm right, fast forward to 2018, still the same Benjamin Netanyahu standing on that stage in Tel Aviv. Behind him are all these CDs that he stole from the Iranian bunker in Tehran, presenting them by taking off these black pieces of fabric, revealing those CDs to the world. Benjamin Netanyahu, besides his very bombastic dramatics, also sent those CDs to the P5+1, to Germany, the United States, the EU, Russia, and the International Atomic Energy Agency. None of those entities declined to accept the CDs, though if the piecemeal approach is correct, they should have rejected this, for otherwise they would be complicit in a violation of international law. Think about it, the IAEA should accept espionage that was gathered covertly in the territory of Iran. That's against sovereignty. And yet they all accepted it with glee and analyzed it and reached various conclusions about it, proving that they did not find what Israel did a violation of the law, but saw it completely a legitimate act of the state. Now, recognizing that states have a right to spy does not mean that that right is just a carte blanche to do whatever they want. No, quite the opposite. By recognizing a right, we can start talking about situations that abuse that right. So in my book, I talk about those 3 stages for regulating spying and start to articulate various scenarios in which the right to spy may be abused, both within the moment where we launch the operation and in the choice of means and targets in the conduct of the operation. I'll end my presentation with 2 quick case studies or examples that demonstrate potential abuses of the right to spy. The first one is a really famous story from back in the bin Laden chase days of 2009-10, where the CIA engaged in a fake vaccination campaign in Pakistan, in which it placed a few of its own men in an operation that sought to collect DNA samples from people in the Pakistani area where bin Laden was perceived to be located. And the idea was, as unrealistic as it may seem, that through the collection of all these DNA samples, they will be able to find some evidence that would spot where bin Laden was hiding. But as luck would have it, the operation was revealed, and what it actually resulted is hundreds and thousands of families in Pakistan refusing to vaccinate their children for the polio vaccine because they believed it was all a Western hoax created to support these sorts of espionage operations. So here you have a great example of an abuse of the right to spy in choosing a particular mean of spying, which is both at once unlikely to achieve its goals, it's so unlikely to succeed, and simultaneously could result in disproportionate consequences that go beyond the purported aim to be achieved. By applying these basic standards, which I would argue to you already exist in state practice, we might be able to articulate which kinds of espionage operations are lawful or unlawful. Indeed, in the wake of the revelations of this operation, multiple heads of medical schools across the United States wrote to then Obama, the president of the United States, asking him to disavow this operation and to commit to never engage in operations that involve masquerading intelligence officers within medical teams, certainly ones handled by the UN, which the CIA chief then later did. So it goes to show you that even states admit at certain circumstances that certain kinds of these operations might be illegal. Another example could be Solarwinds, a big story that happened earlier this year, which was an alleged Russian operation that engaged in a supply chain attack that resulted in a lot of civilian casualties, civilian data as casualty. So that is, if you're using your specific kind of cyber tools to collect information in a way that could have the same kind of vibrating effects or echoing effects that go beyond the target, therefore making it more mass as opposed to targeted, less controllable as opposed to controllable. Again, we might be able to draw lines of proportionality to begin to set the scene for kinds of intelligence operations which might be illegal. One of my favorite spy stories of all times, though, is Australia and East Timor. Australia spied on East Timor when East Timor was building up its first ever presidential palace upon granting independence in the early 2000s. And it was so happy to do so, but it didn't have the resources to build that presidential palace and manifest its sovereignty in that way because it was a developing country. So they reached out to Australia, who helped send a construction team as aid workers to build the palace. But what they did not tell them is that they were placing recording pods across the walls of the palace as it's being built. Now you can ask yourself already there, why? What's in Australia's interest to engage in such a costly and risky operation in East Timor? And the answer was that there was gas in the East Timorese Sea, that Australia knew about that gas, and they wanted to get an early lead about this gas through surveillance. And in fact, when the East Timorese discovered surveillance in 2006, they began negotiating with Australia to help them extract the gas from the sea. Australia even spied on them during treaty negotiations and bettered their negotiation positions using that surveillance. What this case example demonstrates to you is that sometimes states will spy not for the purpose of advancing national security or international security, but for other purposes, purposes that I would argue go beyond what is allowed within this body of regulation. So we can talk in the Q&A, what would be justifications that are legitimate or illegitimate for the use of spying? But I will end my presentation with one final story. This story is about my days working for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So I was working in the office of the prosecutor that brought a case against Ratko Meladic on the right, the former chief of staff of the Bosnian Serb army. And my job was to testify various witnesses that came to present evidence that Ratko Meladic knew and ordered a genocide in the former Yugoslavia. And one of these people was the person on the left, Suleiman Cincalo, whose wife died in a shelling in a marketplace called Markela, Sarajevo in 1995. And I prepared Suleiman Cincalo for his testimony for 3 weeks, going over again and again the evidence that he will present, what evidence we will present, and the story and script. And we had only one real rule, and that rule was that he should keep a locked gaze on the prosecution team, because the defense, especially Ratko Meladic, might cry and shout and scream and try to break his composure. And so the day of the testimony arrived, and Suleiman Cincalo reached a point in his testimony where he described how he found his dad's wife's body in a morgue. And he identified her as Cincalo Pasa. Now, the script that we had created had just said, I identified her as Cincalo Pasa, but in reality, Suleiman Cincalo went into a 5-minute frenzy in which he screamed his dad's wife's name for about multiple minutes in front of the court. And the judges just let him get the cathartic moment of doing just that because they understood the importance of the moment. Later, he came and saw me. I put his hand on my shoulder and he told me in broken English, because he mostly spoke Serbo-Croatian, told me, it's only human to cry. I remember this moment vividly. It's the most profound moment I had in my entire international legal career. For me, what I took from that moment is that it proves to you that the unregulatable can be regulated. Going back to World War II, it would be unimaginable to think that we in real time can take the former chief of staff of the Bosnian Serb army and put him in front of the people the victims who he had hurt, and have them scream in front of him, the loved ones who he directly ordered to kill. But we've achieved that, perhaps to some degrees of success, through the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols. and through international criminal courts. We're now being told something very similar, that you can't possibly regulate spying because when the spies connive, the muses fall silent. I don't want to believe that anything in the world of state practice is subject to unregulation, that it cannot be regulated. It just takes a lot of time and effort and the belief that something needs to be done. And so that is, in a nutshell, what the book tries to do. Okay, I've gone a little overboard, so I'll stop here and looking forward to your questions.
All right. Well, thank you for a great presentation. I'm just gonna pin you there so that everyone can see. The first question was actually someone wanted to ask about your book, and so they're looking forward to it. So if you can just talk very briefly about that and when it's coming out.
Sure. I'll be as transparent as I can. By June, I need to submit the final manuscript. It should come out by fall of next year. I probably also will come down to Hebrew University at one point to present it as part of a broader book launch. So we're looking around fall of 2022.
All right, I think we'll all hopefully be looking forward to that. So now people, if you do have questions, please submit in the chat box. One other question that we already had come in was the idea, I'm going to paraphrase here, of spying almost for good. Like if you're looking for almost like the good people in your enemy's territory, like you're looking to find that commonality, like where does that lie in your thoughts?
So, I'm sorry, I missed the beginning. If you're gonna.
Oh, the idea that if you're almost like spying for good, so like if you're going into enemy territory, but you're looking for people who have are like-minded like you, how does that fall in as opposed to espionage for just collecting information? I see. So my definition does not distinguish between different types of intelligence techniques, what we call in the business INTs, which is intelligence gathering techniques. So one common int is UMINT. So be a UMINT or SIGINT or VISINT or OSINT, whatever it is, my rules apply equally. Now, I want to talk about UMINT because I think that's where the question is going. To what extent does my rules and my proposals better regulate UMINT collection, which involves by definition, for those of you who kind of watch some Cold War movies, you might be familiar with this, identifying vulnerabilities, not in systems or networks that can be exploited, but in humans. We're trying to identify things that humans are vulnerable for, and then use that to turn them into double agents. So you might think about an addiction. You might think about sexual orientation. You might think about family illness, and we can provide the cure. We can use either carrots or sticks. We can say, if you don't work with us, we'll disclose something to your family, or if you work with us, we'll give you immunity, or we'll get you into our country, or we will provide a medicine to. And all of this, nothing here is new. All of this has been reported about. I don't feel like I'm breaching any secrets by sharing this. So how do we think about that? Now, I'll tell you a personal story. I'm a happily married gay man. And I was, at the time when I was asked to do this, was asked to collect information about a particular target who turned out to be gay. At the time, I was a closeted individual, but I had to write a whole report to share with our human collection entities in the Israeli intelligence, who would then use the sexual orientation of that individual in whatever way they did. I obviously had no knowledge about what the specifics of what they did was, but I needed to provide them with an actual portfolio of that. So how do you feel about that at the time where I was struggling with my own sexuality in collecting information about someone else's, which I knew could be used in certain ways? I think this is some of the more complex aspects of this industry. And I don't know if in my book I have good solutions for it, besides to say that to some extent I'm realistic that this practice will not go away, and that there's hard ethical questions to be drawn about good and bad, values and interests in conducting these sorts of operations. I will also mention that there's a great book written by an international relations scholar called Sexuality and Intelligence that talks about the intersectionality between
intelligence officers who are gay or the collection. Defining intelligence itself as a queer profession, which is between soft law and hard law. A lot of really interesting stuff has been come out in the literature in recent years that I think might be interesting to some of the folks here.
Very nice. I guess one other thing is, where do you, so for, you had said that a lot of your colleagues you very much admire, but disagree with. Mm-hmm. So how do they feel about your viewpoint?
Yeah, so one of my favorite people of all time is Russell Buchan. Russell Buchan wrote a book called Cyber Espionage and International Law. It came out a year and a half ago. Me and Russell are really good friends, and we disagree on everything. His primary argument against my book, or against my position, because I want to be, again, I don't want to give you any impression that I'm the only one who's necessarily right in this battle. So his argument for why I'm wrong is that the current existing state practice and opinion juris, which are elements for the existence of customary international law, for those who are not fully familiar with the language, has not yet proven that my arguments are there. And I'm willing to play along and say that maybe we need more time. We need states to articulate better what they legally think about espionage before we can reach a point where we say custom has evolved enough here. But if you think about where the world was 30 years ago, compared to where the world is now, it would be unimaginable for me to write my dissertation 30 years ago. The world during the Cold War, about what we knew or didn't know about spying, what states were willing to put in the books as primary legislation about their intelligence operations, to admit publicly about intelligence operations, was very, very different, to say the least. We now live in a world where so much of this practice is public, and it's public because of whistleblowers like Snowden, but it's also public because of freedom of information requests. It's public because there's been certain periods of time, say 50 years, and now there's mandatory disclosures by law of old archives and databases. And it's also public because there's a greater pressure on governments to speak more forthcomingly about the way they're engaging in intelligence and the law that governs their operations. And so I think that the trajectory is one that would justify thinking about the world in the way that I do, so that even if Russell Buchan is correct and we haven't yet reached that point, those who adopt the piecemeal approach should ask themselves, how much more evidence do you need before you'd be willing to admit that maybe the world has shifted to the one that I espouse?
All right, I'm going to make a last call for any questions. While we're waiting to see if any come in, one I personally have is how realistic are the James Bond movies or any other like spy movies?
So the problem with James Bond is the problem with Hollywood in general is that you need a lead. So the assumption so much with these movies is that there's a primary actor who's doing everything. And intelligence is a teamwork effort. Intelligence cannot be done by a single person, and no one person is able to provide everything, as James Bond often does in his movies. And so that's definitely one element of it. Another element of this is that there's a lot less soirees and tuxes in intelligence than there is in real life. So I think there's a lot more every day going to work, getting your coffee, sitting in front of computers for 7 hours, but that would not be fun for a Hollywood movie. So no surprise that they don't show that part of intelligence work.
That is fair. So less black tie events and more mundane office work. Understood. All right, we just got one more in from Sandy. Can a president declassify national security information, and can that be retroactive? Must the original classifier be contacted? Is there a difference between national security and private personal information?
What a great question. I could probably have a whole presentation just on that. So let me try and give some general overview answers to this, but there really is a lot that can be said. First of all, part of the problem in US political discourse is an over tendency to classify over declassify. what the intelligence community has already revealed in the post-Snowden era is that too much of the information was classified because everyone's worried about their own doing something wrong, that everyone overclassifies instead of declassify. What the Snowden revelations revealed is that if we want to ensure legitimacy in this business, if we want to ensure that the public trusts the intelligence community to continue to do this covert, inherently secret work, then we need to be more forthcoming to the extent that we can and develop declassification rules that better protect that trust between the public and the intelligence community. And so one thing that the intelligence community did post-Snowden is something called IC on the Record, which I invite you all to Google and search. IC on the Record is a website created by the US intelligence community where every year, thousands of intelligence documents are just dumped and declassified, become public. And that was a great move started in the Obama era to try and make the intelligence community more transparent about how it conducts its operations. But there's still so much about this practice that is subject to secret law by secret courts, namely the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And so a lot of organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation have pushed back and saying that more can be done in both setting regulations on declassification rules and about what is put forward into the public eye in terms of rules and regulations and actual operations, so to advance transparency in this space. The other last thing I would mention, just because the question kind of alluded to it with the must original declassifier be contacted, some of the more complex issues are not within one state, but in the interstate context. So what happens when intelligence is being granted by state A through intelligence sharing arrangements, providing the intelligence to state B? Now state B wants to declassify. And a lot of times in the intelligence sharing arrangements, there will be a provision that says that the originating state has control over any uses of the intelligence with third parties or with the public or in any other way. This is called the originator rule doctrine. So part of the problem is the originator rule would therefore create declassification problems for the receiving state. And so there's been, for example, in that pragmatic camp that I mentioned that Ashley Deeks is a great believer of, there's been those who have proposed that intelligence communities could regulate each other, that just by the interchange between communities, we can have an net positive versus net negative going up instead of down in the advancement of particular policies or regulations. But if we create hindrances on the abilities of intelligence communities to regulate, to be a check on each other, such as in the context of the originator rule doctrine, we are limiting our ability in the long run to have these intelligence frameworks serve that purpose. But I can name one case that I think is demonstrative of where this does work effectively. That's the Schrems case before the Court of Justice of the European Union, where the Court of Justice of the European Union said that if companies in America want to receive personal information from Europeans as part of their conduct of their business, as data flows continue to flow from Europe to the US, first, the US needs to better regulate its surveillance and intelligence rules to meet with European standards. And only then will we find the US adequate as a receiver of personal information, demonstrating beautifully where there is a possibility to rely on the community and regulations of one state to compel regulation shifts in another country. So that's one example, but there's only few of those in reality and practice.
All right, well, we are just up on time.